Okay, good afternoon to everyone. Dear academic community and dear colleagues and friends, it's my pleasure to welcome all of you to the Effort and Social Inequality Conference and ECSR thematic conference as part of the ERC Effort project led by Professor Jonas Rald. As you may know, Professor Jonas Rald's project is hosted at the Carlos III Juan March Institute. This is the institute that I'm currently being the director of. The institute, in its current form, was created in 2013 in the Carlos III University campus in Getafe, but it has a long history of more than 25 years dedicated to the training of social scientists and the promotion of excellence in research. I'm actually very glad to see in the program of this conference some of our former postdocs and PhDs presenting together with some of our current members. Today, the Carlos III Juan March Institute brings together outstanding senior social scientists with highly promising junior ones. It provides those scholars with a stimulating intellectual environment, one that nurtures the production of high-level research, which the development of this project very well illustrates. We all know that it's not easy to conduct high-level research, as our work usually cohabitates with, I would say, small doses of success and usually bigger doses of difficulties and failures. To briefly describe what we do and how we contribute to the cumulative and ongoing nature of research in the social sciences, let me use the history of this building, the building you are currently visiting, as an illustration of the work that we do. Almost a century ago, in this area, in this neighborhood, there was a very popular fishing market named Puerta de Toledo, which had been built in the 1930s. Later on, in the late 1970s, when the Spanish transition to democracy occurred, this area had become a rundown neighborhood. So in the 1980s, someone thought that it would be a good idea to change the old structure and refurbish it in an attempt to attract new commercial brands and turn this area into something similar to a shopping center. Although the idea of the shopping center failed, actually the reforms that had been done in the 1980s opened up, created new opportunities for new projects, which actually became a reality when the University Carlos III decided to rebuild what had been done to turn this building into the hub of the university's postgraduate training, which is its current form. So the takeaway of this lesson, of this story, is clear. We all develop our research building up on our own or someone else's previous failures, upon ideas that, although we thought some time ago that they would work and ended up going nowhere, they also planted the seeds for more promising arguments and projects. A crucial step in that never-ending search for answers in which we are all involved is the communication of what we do and the exposure of our theoretical arguments and empirical findings to our peers. And this is what this conference will offer you. This is what this conference will do to your research. Provide new foundations, also to show the limitation or the confirmatory feedback of your projects. And this is the way in which all together, as part of a community, we will be contributing to build and rebuild, leaving a trace maybe for the future generations of scholars who decide to join us in this endless journey through knowledge that doing social research it represents. Thank you very much.
Many thanks, Sandra. Leon, very, very nice welcoming words. I also want to welcome everybody from my side. I don't want to make further long speeches, just acknowledge our sponsors, the Institute, Carlos III Juan Marc, also the European Consortium of Sociological Research, and the European Research Council most importantly. And I really hope we will have very engaging, fruitful intellectual exchanges over the coming 3 days, and also in the breaks and over the dinner tomorrow evening. Just a quick hint that if you don't have access to EduRoam and you want to use the internet, here's the credentials, if you haven't seen that already. And now it's my honor to introduce our first keynote speaker, Kaspar Burger. Kaspar Burger is an SNSF, a Swiss National Science Fund Excellenza professor at the University of Zurich, at the Institute of Sociology, and he's also directing the Jakob Center of Productive Youth Development. He's also an honorary professor at the Institute of Education at UCL in London. Previously, he was also a Marie Curie fellow, showing his European mobility, and he's held various positions at the Sorbonne, University of Maryland, College Park, Geneva, and University of Minnesota, Twin Cities. Kaspar has a very interdisciplinary research program that's highly relevant to the themes of the conference. While he has formerly been trained as a psychologist, his work has a very strong footing in sociological themes, such as educational trajectories, social stratification, intergenerational transmission of inequalities, and motivational differences between and within individuals. His wide-ranging research interests even extend to areas such as the history of child care and children's participatory rights. He has published in reputed venues such as the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, the European Sociological Review, the Journal of Adolescence, Research in Social Stratification and Mobility, and many others. Owing to Kaspar's stellar research record and his broad interdisciplinary approach to social inequality and child development, we thought he would be an excellent person to give the opening keynote at our conference. We're very happy to have him. Please give a warm welcome to Kaspar Burger.
Yeah, well, that is humbling. Thank you very much for these introductory words. It is also very nice that you didn't just copy and paste the small text that I have on my website. So this really distinguishes you. Thank you so much. It is and I should unfortunately correct one element of the short speech that you gave. So I'm not directing the Jakob Center for Youth Development, but I'm also affiliated with that center. It's a great pleasure and an honor to give this talk today. I think it's already become clear that I'm going to present interdisciplinary work. So I'm mainly interested in education, social inequalities, the life course. I want to understand how unequal educational opportunities lead to unequal life course outcomes. And today, I will try to delve into a life course perspective on educational inequalities. In particular, I will revisit a long-standing debate, the agency debate. I will import this debate into educational research. The talk has three main chapters. The first chapter, I would like to introduce my reading of the agency structure debate. I want to explain it. Yes, you can, okay, now you can hear. Apologies. So I will speak about the agency structure debate. I will introduce the theoretical framework. Then I will have a second chapter in which I seek to demonstrate how agency and structure interact in shaping educational trajectories. And in the third chapter, I would like to highlight how the power of agency and structure may also be subject to historical variation. So essentially, this talk is based on 3 studies, 2 of which are published, and the third is currently ongoing work. First chapter. The agency structure debate is a long-standing debate in many disciplines, including philosophy, sociology, psychology, political science, anthropology, law, and more recently also environmental science. It reflects the key concern about the relationship between micro and macro determinants of human behavior and life courses. It also reflects a concern revolving around the tension between free will and determinism. This is particularly relevant, for instance, if you think of lawsuits. It also touches upon the dualism between internal and external drivers of human behavior and life course outcomes. And more broadly speaking, some scholars just say that it's about individuals on the one hand side and society on the other. Now, almost a quarter of a century ago, Emmer, Bayer, and Misch argued that the term agency has maintained a resonant vagueness, and I think that's still true today. Hitlin and Elder argued that it is quite slippery and is used differently depending on the epistemological roots and goals of scholars. Nowadays, agency is associated with various concepts, including motivation, volition, will and effort, purposiveness and initiative, freedom, choice, or the capacity to take action, the ability to initiate change, or Clausen has also called it planful competence, and Albert Bandura has argued that agency reflects personal causality. So this is the semantic field in which we are moving, essentially. Now, as much as agency seems to be a complicated term, structure is as well. So Sewell argued that it is one of the most important and most elusive terms. It's been conceived of as primary or hard and stable, immutable like the girders of a building. Some scholars have thought that it's actually constraints that exist apart from individual action. Anthony Giddens has associated the concept with rules and resources, and William Sewell argued that cultural schemas and rituals provide structure. So there are different types of structure, including institutional, social, and historical. Now, the question is, does agency represent freedom of free will and structure constraints? Well, I think by now it's become clear that it's a little more complicated. So there are interdependencies between agency and structure. So structure and agency are not opposed, but presuppose each other. This is also clear in Anthony Giddens' theory of structuration. So structures do not simply place constraints on human agency, but are also enabling. So they may determine thoughts and behaviors, but they may also facilitate them. So they restrict and empower action. And so some have argued that theorizing the agency structure dualism is actually the quintessential focus of sociological endeavors. Now, within a life course framework, we can quickly understand that agency encompasses an orientation toward the past, the present, and the future. The past, because agency is a result of socialization processes and a result of the internalization of habits and routines. Now, agency in the present just means acting and exercising control, perhaps exerting effort in a given moment. But then there's also a future component to agency. Agency means exerting influence to shape
one's life trajectory and to work towards a future goal. Now, Albert Bandura has distinguished a couple of core properties of agency, and in his theory, agency involves intentionality and forethought. So, in a way, forethought is the temporal extension to agency. Why? Because people form intentions that include action plans and strategies for realizing them. And so forethought includes the anticipation of likely outcomes of prospective actions. And as such, forethought can become relevant for, well, steering our actions and behaviors. In my understanding, how I theorize agency, I distinguish two elements. I consider agency to be intentional self-motivated action or self-initiated action. This is one element, and the other element is the future component. So future expectations, in my reading of the literature, are also part of agency because they promote goal-directed behavior, they steer action, they serve as a guide and motivator of behavior. So in as much as people think that their lives will pan out according to plan, they will also exhibit goal-oriented behaviors, and as a consequence, they will be more likely to achieve certain goals. So people with positive expectations tend to persevere in the face of hardships. There is also evidence suggesting that more optimistic future expectations are associated with better self-regulation. People bounce back from setbacks. They're also just hardworking well, not generally speaking, but by tendency. So this was the theoretical background. I'll now proceed to the second chapter, in which I'll present two studies that describe the interplay of agency and structure in educational trajectories. So educational trajectories are characterized by specific transitions. Transitions are the junctures at which educational trajectories can diverge, but they can also converge again. And so these transitions are particularly relevant as a dimension to study in the sociology of education. And I want to understand how human agency and institutional structure both shape specific transitions at multiple time points. And then I'm also interested in understanding how institutional structure and human agency interact in shaping these transitions. Most of you, if not all of you, will certainly be aware that education systems across the world are hierarchically differentiated, so they sort students into distinct educational paths, or so-called tracks, and in so doing, they structure both students' careers through school, but also their prospects after graduation, because schools and education systems issue credentials that will then open up specific sets of opportunities in the labor market, but will also foreclose others. And against that backdrop, educational systems have been called sorting machines for the first time by Joel Spring, precisely for the reason I invoked. So despite their egalitarian ethos, education systems lay the foundation for later life inequalities. Now, this is true for the Swiss education system as well, from which I provide empirical evidence. This illustration just shows that after primary school, students are assigned to different tracks at lower secondary level. And these tracks are distinguished by different academic demands, ranging from basic or to extended, or what I call low to high. And then in a couple of cantons, we have some systems that do not use any formal tracking. So these would be the comprehensive schools that also appear. And at upper secondary level, the main distinction is between academic education in baccalaureate school and vocational education and training. And at the tertiary level, we have different institutions, including the conventional universities and then the universities of teacher education and of applied sciences and colleges of higher education. Now, the takeaway message from this slide is that there are qualitatively different pathways through the education system, and they allow for both normative and non-normative trajectories. So there are standard pathways which are followed by a majority of students, and then there are the non-standard pathways which are also open for students to take. Their educational trajectories are then characterized by a more complicated set of transitions and a somewhat longer educational trajectory. And today I will examine in particular the transition from lower secondary education to upper secondary education, and from there to university at the tertiary level. Now, in the past, scholars have analyzed educational trajectories in stratified systems, for instance in Germany. So we have some evidence on the distinct pathways that students follow and the proportions of students who follow certain pathways. However, what is lacking, or what was lacking in the literature, was an understanding of the role of individual human agency in these educational trajectories. So education systems may channel individuals into specific trajectories by imposing institutional constraints. However, obviously, individuals choose which educational goals to engage with, which to disengage from, and so they pursue their own educational projects, at least to some extent. So with this in mind, the key objective here is to understand the relative importance of institutional structure, or tracks, and human agency for educational trajectories in terms of these transitions, the probability to academic upper secondary education and the probability to transition to university will be under investigation here. I used data from the TREE survey, the Transitions from Education to Employment. That is a longitudinal survey that has followed individual life trajectories. It's actually a PISA 2000 follow-up study that has been conducted in Switzerland ever since. So initially the sample came from the PISA 2000 study, which used the two-stage stratified sampling procedure. And by now there is a second cohort that has been followed. I'm focusing on this first cohort from 2000 up to now. I use indicators of human agency, namely persistence. I measure persistence and study effort using multiple items. And now here's where I get a little nervous, because I know that Jonas has worked on the discrepancies between self-reports and objective indicators of effort, and I'm not doing that. I'm just relying on self-reports, and I believe that they're valuable as such, so they still tell us something about individual self-concepts and individuals who think that they are very persistent in general. Well, they will also behave differently from people who don't think that they're in general persistent people. So this is just to say I'm using two measures of human agency. One is capturing persistence and the other is capturing study effort. And then I'm using, I have data available about students' track attendance at the lower secondary level, at the upper secondary level, and at the tertiary level. I just focus on whether or not individuals ever enrolled at the university over a period of up to 10 years. So this is convenient because obviously if you think of the individuals who follow non-normative or pursue non-normative trajectories, they will enter a university later than their counterparts who have a more standard trajectory. And so I'm still able to capture those. I used structural equation modeling, which has a couple of advantages, among which that I'm able to minimize measurement error and that I'm able to model multiple endogenous variables simultaneously. Now let me present some descriptive evidence. First, This Sankey diagram just shows the proportions of students who follow specific pathways. So you'll note quite quickly that the non-normative trajectories were observed much less frequently than than normative trajectories. For instance, students starting in a high track with extended academic requirements are likely to pursue academic upper secondary education and then are quite likely to also enroll at the university. And this contrasts with very small proportions of individuals who start their educational careers in a track with basic requirements and then through more complicated pathways pursue an academic trajectory later on. Now remember, I want to understand how institutional structure and human agency predict the transition probabilities into academic education. And arguably the most important confounder in such an enterprise is obviously academic achievement or performance levels. So in a preliminary or in a pre-analysis, I investigated the achievement distributions in the lower secondary tracks. So when the panel started, and what this density plot shows is that on average, students in high tracks outperformed those in intermediate and low tracks, and also those in comprehensive schools as expected. But importantly, there's also a considerable overlap in these achievement distributions. In other words, a considerable proportion of actually low achievers attended high tracks, academic tracks, and vice versa. So, and in fact, the area of common support here is 97%. So I also ran the analysis excluding those 3% where there was no overlap whatsoever. And that is very little. Now, I was also interested in understanding the distributions of human agency across tracks. And these are shown in these box plots. So we see individuals' study effort, the distributions of study efforts in high tracks, intermediate tracks, comprehensive schools, and low tracks. And yes, it's accurate that to say that in the high and intermediate tracks, self-reported study effort is higher than in the other tracks. But then when we focus at the upper secondary level, the distributions are much more, are strikingly similar. And here at the upper secondary level, I have indicators of persistence and study effort. So I'll now turn to the results from the main modeling, the structural equation model, which are depicted here. So I have indicators of human agency measured as latent constructs and indicators of institutional structures, so the tracks. And because this is complicated and the probit coefficients are also hard to interpret, I converted the results into predicted probabilities, which will be much more intuitive to interpret, and which I'll show now. Now, this shows the transition probabilities into academic upper secondary education as a function of, as a function of track attendance and self-reported study effort. So what this shows is, if we focus first on those students who attended the high track at the lower secondary level, that they were estimated to have a probability of roughly 44% to transition to academic upper secondary education. And this contrasted with a 25% predicted probability among students in the comprehensive schools, a 13% predicted probability among students in intermediate tracks, and only 6% predicted probability among those in low tracks. So that clearly highlights the channeling function of the education system and tells us how, well, to what extent actually it was feasible or infeasible to transition to academic upper secondary education, depending on where students started their careers. However, that only speaks to the structure. Now, I also here disentangle the effect of study effort. We focus, for instance, on the students in the high tracks. Then we see that study effort was significantly related to individuals' transition probabilities. So those who reported comparatively low levels of study effort had a predicted probability of 44% to transition to academic upper secondary education. Those who reported high levels of study effort were estimated to have a 54% probability to transition to academic education. Now, the same patterns we find also for students in the other tracks, but here it's not as remarkable again. So in fact, the effect of study effort was more discernible here than among students in the other tracks. If we now turn to the transition probabilities to university, then the contrast becomes even more stark, actually, well, quite strikingly so. So here we see that those in academic upper secondary education had a predicted probability of around 50% to ever enroll at the university. Those who initially pursued vocational education had a probability of 3%, and those who were in some other activity, who pursued some other activities, had an even lower transition probability. And here, the effect of human agency was quite attenuated. So it was actually it was quite weak. This tells us to what extent also these students were channeled along certain pathways. And you can see it also with the confidence intervals overlapping significantly. All right, and so I know most of you are thinking in numbers, but here, just for those of you who are thinking more in language, so pursuing academic education at the upper secondary level was associated with a 47 percentage point or 16-fold higher probability of moving to university. And statistically speaking, human agency did not matter, but that's the human agency we can measure, and obviously there are limitations to what we can do in this sense. So to summarize, the educational pathways that students took influenced their educational trajectories. Human agency played a comparatively minor role in that regard. The education system channeled educational trajectories, but the power of channeling, the power of the channeling effect varied across the different junctures of the system. So the channeling effect was stronger at the transition to university than at the earlier transition. Now I'm still in the second chapter, but I'm going to present the second study within this chapter. To simplify, I'm still working with the same data. I'm still looking at the same transitions, but I have a slightly different substantive focus. And so I'll explain this now. We all know that socioeconomic origin influences educational attainment. And also, many of you will know that expectations about the future also influence educational attainment. However, it is unclear just how consequential future expectations are for educational attainment compared to socioeconomic origin. So socioeconomic origin is positively linked with children's educational outcomes because high SES parents provide their children with the experiences, skills, and knowledge that facilitate learning and ultimately foster educational attainment. However, just as socioeconomic origins can shape educational attainment, so can individuals' expectations about their own future. Now, in the literature, expectations are understood as the subjective appraisals of the likelihood that specific events will occur. And these expectations influence goal setting, planning, motivation, and goal-oriented behavior. Admittedly, future expectations in part reflect one's place within the social stratification system, but there's also quite a bit of evidence that social origins and expectations are to some extent independent of each other. And against this background, I seek to disentangle the relative importance of social origin and expectations about one's own future socio-economic status for educational attainment. Broadly speaking, I want to understand whether educational attainment is largely determined by the structural context of socioeconomic disadvantage or advantage in which people grow up, or whether young people's future expectations could be perhaps equally important for educational attainment processes, and if so, they might potentially enable intergenerational social mobility. So this is the first objective, and the second objective is to determine whether institutional structures moderate the effects of social origin and future expectations on educational attainment, because the channeling structure might restrict the influence of social origins and future expectations on educational attainment. I have two hypotheses. First, that young people's expectations about their future socioeconomic status predict subsequent educational attainment as powerfully as socioeconomic origins. And second, that educational tracks moderate the influence of both socioeconomic origin and future expectations on educational attainment. So I'm kind of expecting that these tracks put lower and upper bounds to the potential influence of social origins and expectations on educational attainment. I measure socioeconomic origin using Parents Standard International, Parents standing on the Standard International Socioeconomics Index of Occupational Status Score. And I capture expected socioeconomic status, that is future expectations, on that very same scale. So perhaps it's me who is bothering Mike. Tell me if I speak too much. All right, so I think this is crucial. I have a measure of parental socioeconomic status and a measure of future expectations, and it's on the same scale. And I think this is important to understand here. So 15-year-olds were asked to answer what kind of job they expect to have when they are about 30 years old. Then I have a bunch of covariates. Here I use linear probability path models and non-linear logistic path models, and I also express the results as predicted probabilities. Here again, I would like to start by showing some descriptive evidence. So this scatter plot shows on the horizontal axis parental socioeconomic status, and on the vertical axis expected socioeconomic status, that is future expectations. And the different bubbles represent the students in different educational tracks. And you'll see the blue light color represents students who attended academic tracks at the lower secondary level, with and the red bubbles represent those who attended non-academic or, well, vocationally oriented tracks. And we see a little bit of, with this scatter plot, we see already quite clearly that students in academic tracks tend to be of higher socioeconomic origins and tend to have higher future expectations for themselves, and vice versa. And this picture becomes even clearer if we focus on the distributions at the upper secondary level. So here, the blue bubbles represent those in academic upper secondary education, and the red bubbles represent those in in the vocational education and training. So these in vocational education and training tend to be of lower socioeconomic origins and tend to have lower future expectations for themselves than those in the academic path. Now, to understand the relative importance of social origins and future expectations on the different transitions, I ran these linear probability path models, and the main finding is outlined here. So what I see is that a 1 standard deviation increase in parental socioeconomic status is associated with an 8.6 percentage point increase in the probability to transition to academic upper secondary education. However, a 1 standard deviation increase in future expectations is associated with a 16.1 percentage point increase in the probability to transition to university. And also, I ran a chi-square difference test, and thus noted that the 2 coefficients are significantly different from each other. That means that future expectations were significantly more powerful as a predictor than socioeconomic status. Now, when we focus on the transition to tertiary education, university, we see a similar pattern with, again, future expectations having greater, statistical, predictive power, although here the difference is not as fundamental anymore, and also the coefficients are only, still significantly different from each other, but only at the 5% significance level. Now, the second question was whether the educational tracks moderate the effects of socioeconomic origins and future expectations on educational attainment. And this is what I want to explain here, and these are the results from logistic regression models, because I wanted to avoid out-of-bound predictions, and also because here I was not interested in average effects. Now, what we see in these 2 diagrams is the transition probability on the y-axis and how it varies as a function of track attendance, depicted with the different lines, and as a function of parental socioeconomic status in the left panel, and as a function of future expectations in the right panel. So to be more specific, if we focus on those who attended a high academically oriented track at lower secondary level, we see that they were estimated to have a probability of 13% to transition to academic education if they were from low SES families. But this rose up to 86% for those who came from very privileged families. And here, a relatively similar pattern of results is found when I look at the influence of future expectations. So future expectations were not as so before I said that future expectations were more important than parental socioeconomic status, but when we consider the educational tracks that students attended, then this is a little, the effect is minimized. And that also speaks to the channeling effect of these tracks. And then when we focus on the transition to tertiary education, university, we find a similar pattern. So it's the same logic again. We have the transition probabilities as a function of parental socioeconomic status on the left side and future expectations here. But importantly, at any given level of parental socioeconomic status and future expectations, those who attended an academic track were significantly more likely to transition to a university later in their lives. So we also have a little bit of a gradient here among those who initially pursued vocational education, but we're nowhere near. And really there, even with a high SES origin, it was quite unlikely, very unlikely, to transition to university later on. So to summarize and conclude, relative to socioeconomic origin, expectations about the future socioeconomic status predicted academic educational trajectories even more powerfully. And what young people think about their futures likely influences status attainment. So future expectations might potentially enable intergenerational social mobility. However, when considering educational track attendance, socioeconomic origin and future expectations were less predictive of educational attainment. So that means that educational tracks structured educational trajectories and moderated the importance of SES and expected SES for attainment. And this is also relevant within a life course theoretical framework. So life course theory has, I think, long acknowledged that individual traits or aspects like socioeconomic advantage and optimistic future expectations can only shape attainment to the extent that institutions provide opportunity structures that allow such resources to take effect. So I'm given a signal that 5 minutes are left, and I think that is okay, because I will have a very short, some very short notes about a third study that shows that, with which I seek to shed light on historical variation in the power of human agency. So I think that 5 minutes will do. So now we know future expectations are powerful forces that guide individuals through life. They influence what people can achieve and what they can become. However, open questions remain about the extent to which the influence of future expectations on educational outcomes is specific to a given cohort. Now, in life course theory, there are a number of paradigmatic principles, and one of those is the principle of time and place, which suggests that the life course of individuals is embedded in the historical times and places individuals experience over their lifetime. Here, I ask two questions. First, do adolescents exhibit similar educational expectations across generations? And second, to what extent do adolescents' educational expectations predict subsequent educational outcomes in two consecutive cohorts? The data source we are using and work together with Jalen Mortimer is the youth development study from Minnesota. This initially started with a randomly selected cohort of around 1,000 adolescents who at the time were enrolled in the 9th grade in the St. Paul Public School District. And by now this is a 3-generation study, but the main cohort that has been followed since 1989 was what we call the second cohort. So initially their parents were also surveyed in 1987, but then this second cohort has been followed up to now, and later on when these individuals had children of their own, they were also included in the study if they were at least 11 years old. So this allows us to, well, compare the educational expectations of the second cohort measured in the late 1980s with the educational expectations of the third cohort, which were measured in 2011. I have educational expectations and educational outcomes measures. I estimated a fully recursive structural equation model. And here, this is the conceptual framework. And this is part of a larger study in which I investigate the intergenerational transmission of educational advantage across generations. But here, for the sake of this paper, I'm only interested in two things, namely how future expectations in adolescence predicted educational achievement of the second cohort, and how the future expectations of the third cohort predicted the educational achievement, the educational achievement. Now, the first finding is that the third generation had significantly higher educational expectations than the second generation. Now, another important finding is that educational expectations significantly predicted the GPA, so educational achievement, of the second cohort. However, educational expectations were not significantly related to GPA in the third cohort. Now, interestingly, and as a side note, it's also remarkable that there was a strong direct effect of educational expectations on educational attainment, but also an indirect effect through GPA, so educational achievement in the second cohort. Now, what explains this paradoxical finding? probably educational expansion. So it's interesting to see that at the time the second generation was asked about their educational expectations, there was a tertiary education enrollment rate of roughly 2/3. However, when the third generation was asked about their educational expectations, way over 90% of American individuals in the respective age cohorts were enrolled at some point in tertiary education. So this means there was a near universalization of tertiary education, and with this educational expansion, educational expectations also rose, but at the very same time, these educational expectations became less consequential, so they had fewer implications for later life course outcomes like educational achievement. So educational expansion likely increased educational expectations, but also made these expectations less consequential for achievement. The implications of adolescents' expectations for achievement change across historical time. This would be one of the conclusions. And again, although the benefits of human agency are typically understood to be universal, there is significant variation across historical contexts that I think we should consider. But more generally, variation in educational outcomes and trajectories can be explained by human agency, institutional structures, and the interdependencies between agency and structure. And I think that life course scholarship can do a good job, or can be helpful to advance our understanding of how agency and structure jointly and interactively influence educational trajectories. And here are the funders, and I'm now ready to take questions and happy to answer them.
Yeah, I think so. We have a couple of minutes at least for questions for Kaspar.
So you talked a lot about expectation. Could you talk a little bit about how you would distinguish that from aspiration? What exactly is data? So people are supposed to give realistic expectations of what they think is going to happen, or?
So the question that was asked to the 3 study participants was, what kind of job do you expect to have, do you think you'll have when you're about 30 years old? So this is the typical wording for expectations. In the youth development study, there is also information available about aspirations. And then allow me to say that I struggle a little bit with the distinction between idealistic and realistic expectations and aspirations, simply because it's sometimes not quite clear what realism is. And this is the way the questions were asked, and so it's clearly expectations, and there's no distinction between realistic and idealistic in the data. Yeah.
Thanks. Any further questions? Please, I should tell everybody, if you make a question, we take it as a consent that your voice can be recorded, as this session, as all other sessions in this room will be recorded for the future. Yeah, please. So please refrain from asking if you're not okay with that, just for simplicity. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. This was very impressive. I wondered, did you have a closer look maybe at the group who have a low socioeconomic status but very high expectations about the future education? Because I think it would be very interesting what's happening with this group and what makes them special.
Yes, well, in a way, I'm doing this currently still a little bit. So what I'm doing is, I don't know whether I'll turn it into a paper, but I'm looking at the distance between parental socioeconomic status and individuals' future expectations regarding their own socioeconomic status. So in a sense, this provides you with information that you're asking about. So this includes people who have a very low parental socioeconomic status, but very high expectations. And For them, the expectations are quite predictive of later educational attainment. So it's in a way a different conceptualization, but it confirms the general claim I make that future expectations matter and that they can serve as a guide for future-oriented behavior. Yeah. I didn't do it more specifically. Perhaps you have a different way of operationalizing it in mind, but then we should talk about it in the break. Yeah.
There was another question over there, I think. Yep, Irem. Second row. Yeah.
Thank you very much for the great talk. I have a question about your first study. You mentioned that agency and institutional structure both matter, and even if students are assigned to different tracks by the institution, they still have agency to kind of perform differently in different tracks. But in some systems, well, maybe not anymore, but teacher recommendations had a binding effect, and there we can't really talk about agency because even if the student wants to go to a higher track, the structure just simply doesn't allow the student to go to a higher track. There we can't really talk about agency. So I was just wondering if that's the case in Switzerland, and maybe do we have information on students or their parents asking for re-evaluation of teacher recommendations, and then maybe we can talk better about agency.
Yeah, but I would beg to differ a little bit, because teacher recommendations are also based on students' performance over the school year. So I think that it's not, they don't occur in a vacuum, and they're a result of students' performance, among other things, I admit. But this is exactly what the agency structure debate reveals, I think, that we have something like bounded agency. So there are institutionally set margins to how agency can be influential or cannot. And I think there is no more general statement to be made, but to acknowledge that this is what is happening, and there is a tension between agency and structure as determinants of life course outcomes.
May I jump in there quickly before a last question? Because I think it was very noteworthy in your findings that you found these agency effects, so significant difference according to study effort at the lower educational track level, but then for the second transition you were studying, there was no statistical influence anymore. So I guess, yeah, so one interpretation would be that just at the higher track there's just very little room for maneuver, and really doesn't actually matter anymore how hard kids try. Or another one would be that actually, I guess that would be the benevolent evaluation of the Swiss education system, that the sorting kind of is already working at an early stage. So you already have filtered out the able and hardworking students. So then that's why we wouldn't see it. What would be your best guess?
I'd like to avoid answering this question, because obviously we know that there are some ascriptive factors shaping the assignment to tracks, and some descriptive factors, and some are merit-based and others are not merit-based, and this is a difficult question. What I would like to, and well, I mean, I should be a little more concrete. I think that it's a bit more problematic than that, right? I think that when we saw, for instance, the achievement distributions, we see that it's actually a little messy, and that according to some external achievement evaluation, there's a lot of overlap within tracks, and probably it's also like this is a critical time, youth, adolescence, when a lot is happening, and when lives get complicated for some, and then in this phase of life, having these consequential decisions is difficult. But I'm not the only one saying this, so this has long been known. But I want to say something quickly, just quickly to that extent. I'm only looking at the transitions to universities, the conventional universities, and within the last 20 years, Switzerland has hugely expanded the tertiary education sector, also created many universities of applied sciences and teacher education, and these provide, if I may say, interesting avenues to opportunities in the labor market. And obviously, I don't know in these studies what is happening to those who might end up pursuing studies at the different tertiary education institutions. So perhaps the picture I'm painting is a bit too dark, but yeah.
Thanks a lot. Sandra Leon, as the last question.
Thank you very much for your presentation, Kaspar. I have a question regarding the very last reflection. You said that the weaker role of the educational expectation in the model in the second cohort was related to the expansion of the educational system, right? So I wonder to what extent there might be a complementary or alternative explanation related to shifts in society in their ideological views. To what extent that might be connected, to an increase in the belief in meritocracy, for instance, and more generally, to what extent educational expectations are connected to other attitudes in society that might be more ideologically driven.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, life course scholars know that social change is tremendously important and should always be taken into account in the studies we're doing. I think that there might have been a bit of a decline in the American dream, but it's still well and alive. And I think that it's been alive in both generations that were under investigation here. So I doubt that in the US, future prospects have become quite dire, just as a consequence of different ideological underpinnings of the society. So I think my guess would be that the ideological underpinnings of society have not changed so much within these last 25 years that is covered by this observation period. But I can only speculate about that.
Well, thank you very much, Kaspar, for a very fascinating opening keynote. It was very, very stimulating. And also for the audience for very interesting questions. So we now have a coffee break, and we meet here again in the same room at 3:30. Thank you.
Thank you.